A huge thanks to today's video sponsor, Piedmont Lithium. Hey, what's going on everyone? It's Sean from All Things EV, and I've got some special guests from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, Simon Moores and Vivas Kumar. Thank you so much for taking time to go super deep on batteries and its connected supply chain. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Sean. Good to be here.
Thank you, Sean.
Absolutely. So I want to dive really deep into a couple of different topics, maybe two to four topics here. The first one is, I think a lot of people are really anticipating some interesting things around Tesla's Battery Day. That's if it doesn't change, it will be September 15th in a couple of months. I'm really curious to get your take, Simon, on what you're expecting. Is it going to be as big as what Elon is talking it up to be? Where are you anticipating some of these breaking pieces of news in technology? Where will they be, and what are you expecting?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'm looking for is to see if Tesla are good to what our expectations are, which is making American-made lithium-ion batteries from scratch. Tesla to date have been relying on Panasonic at the Gigafactory to make the batteries and really bring that midstream know-how to the electric vehicle industry. What this shows is what we expect is Tesla bringing in the Maxwell knowledge and then semi-reinventing the way batteries are made. So I'm kind of looking for any changes in the manufacturing process which allow them to do more batteries. And potentially any tweaks in the chemistry, the raw materials, those minerals, metals you put into these lithium-ion batteries to see if the batteries can improve their performance. So they're the few things I'm looking for.
Vivas, do you have anything that you're looking forward to in this Battery Day?
I'm looking forward to a discussion of the supply chain. The batteries are underpinned by a complicated supply chain with mining elements, chemicals elements, as well as specialty cathode, anode manufacturing. There's a huge supply chain that underpins battery cell and battery pack manufacturing. And I would just love to see what the implications of Tesla's announcements are on this overall battery supply chain being built, and what efforts they're going to be taking towards building that supply chain as well.
There appears to be two opportunities for Tesla to innovate here. One is on the cost scale. Are they going to be able to drive down the cost further from what they have right now? And Vivas, you and I were talking about where they stand in terms of cost per kilowatt hour. They're at about $100 per kilowatt hour at the cell level. Is that correct?
So based on publicly available data, we can conclude that they're pretty close to $100 per kilowatt hour. And that's a really big deal. Over the last 10 years, costs have come down from about $1,000 to $100. And $100 per kilowatt hour for a very long time was considered to be the level of battery cell cost at which EVs make economic sense. Now, of course, we've clearly proven out the economic case a long time ago. But then the question now is, what more can be done to further reduce those costs while improving technology and ultimately improving range for the customer? That's where new technology, new materials, new applications would be very exciting to see coming out of Tesla Battery Day.
Is there a chance, Simon, that Tesla pushes further down that cost per kilowatt hour from around the $100 to something like $90 or $80 per kilowatt hour?
I think below 90 is a real push at the moment. I don't think that maybe is possible unless there's any big leaps in manufacturing changes, because with the there's two ways of reducing the cost of a lithium-ion battery. One is to reduce the cost of the raw materials going into it, and next thing is to change how they're made. And really, the latter is scale. You've seen with the Gigafactory that without the Gigafactory, Tesla would not have got anywhere near the $100 per kilowatt hour at a cell level for batteries. They would have even sat around the 130, 40, 50, probably the 150 mark actually. Because what the scale then did is it sparked a lot of this rise of these battery mega factories around the world, that helped push that price down at a time when raw material prices were going to all-time highs. So for me, changing the manufacturing process, adding scale, plus locking in long-term low-cost raw materials have to go hand in hand. The reality is they're not going to, because the raw materials are going to fluctuate as they always have been, lithium and cobalt especially on that front. So therefore, I guess Tesla have to do what they did with making electric vehicles is control what they can, and that's manufacturing.
One of the other bottlenecks of the electric vehicle industry is the scale and the volume in which batteries are being produced. We've seen other automakers run into this challenge of supply constraint. They just can't get enough batteries. And so, I mean, this is maybe a follow-up question for you, Simon. Do you see, for this battery day that Tesla's got, do you see them talking about going into a little bit more detail with what suppliers they're working with? Because this is not just, initially at least, they're not going to single-handedly produce enough volume on their own. They're going to need the help of some of these top-tier suppliers that they maybe have some existing relationships with. Do you expect them to talk a little bit more about this at Battery Day?
It's a tough one, actually. I actually think that the focus will be on how they've integrated the Maxwell purchase. I think that there's a lot of questions over that. How do you integrate that into this new battery line that they've developed that they're going to show off in Fremont? Then what Elon tweeted out was maybe yesterday or the day before was their impact report of where these raw materials are coming from. So that's the first time actually you started to get a flavor, a bit of Tesla being open with the types of companies and suppliers they're working with. So you might get a bit of that. But I still think Tesla always talk about Tesla, rightly so. They always talk about how they innovate, how they've changed certain tweaks in the industry. And you have to bear in mind that the lithium-ion battery industry haven't changed the way they've made batteries since 1992. The biggest change was the Gigafactory, but fundamentally the equipment, and it's just a scale issue there, rather than actually fundamentally changing the nuts and bolts of the steps from A to Z that makes these raw materials. So I personally think they probably won't talk about their suppliers and their ecosystem, but they will talk about their innovations.
Here's why I think that it might be important, because they've got this innovation in the manufacturing process that I think they will certainly go deep into, but they've talked publicly about scaling to terawatt hours of battery supply. How do they do that just based on their existing production process that they have, not only at the Gigafactory, but also at this small-scale battery production facility in the Fremont area? How do they get there? And maybe that's not immediately the terawatt hours of supply, but it appears like we're hearing more news about them partnering together with CATL and LG and, of course, Panasonic. I'm curious, Vivas, is this a collective effort where Tesla's working with everyone, all the top tier suppliers, to get to that terawatt hour or several terawatt hours? Because the need is now. They need this now. So how do they do that without talking about a strategy for working with these other suppliers?
So the question of terawatt hours of batteries goes well beyond Tesla and to the overall automotive industry. Because right now it's not just Tesla trying to expand battery capacity or with orders for expanding battery capacity. It's also the other major automotive companies. In terms of expanding battery capacity, we've already seen a big expansion being announced and construction started. So, right now there's approximately 2.5 terawatt hours globally of battery capacity that's been announced, as well as started commissioning and construction. That's still not going to be enough. If an individual company, like if Tesla itself wants terawatt hours of capacity, they're going to have to come up with the new business model instead of being reliant on external stakeholders, external suppliers, who themselves will face constraints in capital, who themselves will face constraints in input resources like electricity and water. I mean, a Terafactory is a massive deal. The Reno Gigafactory was designed for 35 gigawatt hours, and it would have already been the biggest building by footprint in the world. And so a Terafactory is 30 times bigger than that in terms of annual production. And the business model of relying on external suppliers will have to morph into some sort of incentivization for the external suppliers to either grow alongside Tesla, or for Tesla to make directive investments even further up the supply chain than before. Only time will tell, and I'm really excited for Battery Day to see if they'll reveal more about a Terafactory in the future.
And one thing to add in there, interestingly, B, is it's important to remember when Tesla were designing the Gigafactory back in 2010, 11, and they went to go and see Panasonic before the Gigafactory was devised. Panasonic's output was probably about 7 gigawatt hours. Their capacity was probably in the single digit, maybe 10 gigawatt hours at the time, because the battery industry was only 35 gigawatt hours in size in total. So can you imagine Elon and JB Straubel and the team going to Panasonic saying, we want you to give us 35 gigawatt hours of lithium-ion batteries to quadruple your output just for us, for an electric vehicle company that only sold vehicles in the hundreds at the time, or maybe the thousands. They didn't believe it, right? The battery industry didn't believe they could achieve that. Of course, the Gigafactory and Tesla have proven since that they absolutely can. And right now, you're in the same position. Right now, you're in that next level jump. It's just an order of magnitude bigger. Do battery companies to believe you need 1 terawatt hour, 1,000 gigawatt hours of capacity? Well, if you do the numbers now, you do need that over the next, let's say, 10 years from now, and this is how long it takes to build out. But I think that Panasonic story is really important to know how this conservative lithium-ion battery industry thinks. And yeah.
How important is it that some of these other automakers, traditional automakers, let's just talk about the big three here in North America. You have Ford, you have GM, and Fiat Chrysler. Fiat Chrysler seems to be really, really, really far behind with Ford and GM talking publicly about their intentions for electric vehicles. How much are they going to struggle with getting enough supply if they're reliant on these suppliers like LG Chem to supply the batteries, and are they in trouble if they're not doing something like what Tesla's doing, where they're trying to control that battery supply?
I would say yes. Any automotive OEM that is not taking directive steps towards controlling their battery supply is in a lot of trouble. The number one reason is what you just pointed out, which is supply shortages of this critical raw material. Supply chain of the critical raw materials for batteries, as well as the battery cells themselves. The closest comparable that we have to this is when Apple went out and essentially cornered the market for memory back in 2004 and 2005, because they saw that a similar shortage of memory, which at the time was an important technology for cell phones and for iPods, was not keeping up pace with the consumer demand for their technology devices. Automotive OEMs are now seeing that the consumer demand for electric vehicles is far greater than the pace of construction of new battery capacity. Now, the second reason is because of cost controls. Anywhere from 25 to 40% of the cost of manufacturing an electric vehicle is the battery in the electric vehicle itself. And as a result, OEMs want to control this supply chain in order to strip out as much cost as possible. Automotive is a brutally competitive business from a margin standpoint, and so it should be no surprise that the focus on margin improvement is now on batteries. One example of an action that we've seen is GM and LG Chem announced their Lordstown factory. We've yet to see Ford or FCA here in North America make any similar announcements around battery factories that they will be building in conjunction with their vehicle manufacturing with upstream partners. But I would say it's probably not that far off.
Yeah, I think you're correct. It does seem like here's the pivot that these traditional automakers are going to have to make. Previously to electric vehicles, they didn't have to worry about the supply of the fuel so much to sell a unit, right? It's gasoline or it's diesel, and you could produce a car, sell it to the consumer without needing to have the fuel, without needing to control the fuel. Now with electric vehicles, you cannot sell a unit without having that fuel, the battery pack, with it for the customer. So they're going to be a lot more exposed to these early supply chain challenges with the electric vehicle. And I just find it fascinating that we're not seeing more of an aggressive push, even beyond doing a joint venture with a battery supplier. My question that I'm going to sort of tag on to this statement is, how exposed are these traditional automakers to fluctuation in these raw materials, the commodities of these raw materials? Because if the demand starts to increase, so is the price of these raw materials. So if they don't control the raw materials, is that going to significantly impact the profit margin on their electric vehicles?
That's the big fear on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis, right? It's that manufacturing efficiency improvements can push you closer to that $100 per kilowatt hour. But past a certain point, once you've stripped out as much of the cost as possible through increasing your manufacturing throughput and increasing your manufacturing footprint, you are widely exposed to raw materials prices in nickel, in cobalt, in lithium, in aluminum, in steel. I mean, these are commodities that have been traded on exchanges like the London Metal Exchange, like the Chicago Exchange, for years and years. They're highly capitalized, highly liquid markets in some cases, although the markets for the chemicals themselves that are used in battery manufacturing are not. However, underlying price fluctuations of these metals will cause the dollar per kilowatt hour to fluctuate themselves. Any automotive OEM that doesn't already have a team looking at strategy and looking at supply chain for sourcing these materials is really far behind because of the impact that these fluctuations are going to have on the bottom line for their bill of materials.
Which makes sense because Tesla's got a well built out department. In fact, I think you came from that department, Vivas. They've got a very well built out department who all they do is do the research in terms of supply chain. So are we going to start seeing these other automakers build out and hire teams that all they do is focus on the early supply chain of batteries?
Benchmark has multiple clients along the automotive supply chain and the battery supply chain. What we've seen from our clients is there are many traditional automotive companies that are realizing the challenges of battery supply chain and are staffing up comparable teams, but everybody is in a different level of maturity. Some of the traditional automotive companies do have full teams that are staffed up and are actively looking to sign supply contracts, versus you still have a few traditional autos that still haven't solved the battery question, let alone the battery supply chain question.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's also a problem that will never be solved unless these automakers own the assets, right? So like the biggest challenge, mental challenge for the auto industry is everybody alive in the automotive industry has always dealt with a mature supply chain, a mature industry where the supply chain is already built and scaled. Now, the problem with this is you've got a car industry that exists that's scaled, we all buy cars, but you've got a supply chain that's really niche. That's actually, the supply chain is geared to making batteries for laptops and mobile phones. It's not geared to making batteries for the size of a car outside, right? So I guess my point is that the way you approach a niche supply chain to scale is completely different to the way you approach a mature supply chain. Like, for example, an automotive maker, they're buying tires or they're buying components like windscreen wipers. Well, they would be, I'm your biggest buyer. You exist to really serve me, the automotive OEM. We're going to push that price down as much as we can, year by year, and kind of push overall the cost of the car down if you do that for every component. Well, if you can't get the lithium because there isn't enough capacity in the market and everyone's scrambling for it, then you can't use that strategy. You have to think differently. And so it's a responsibility of every automaker, if they want to make electric vehicles, to actually invest in the supply chain and scale it.
Let's go a little bit deeper here. So it appears like there is quite a bit of raw materials suppliers in South America. If an automotive maker is going fully electric like Tesla is, how important is it that a company like Tesla, or anyone for that matter, Rivian or Lucid Motors, how important is it to source raw materials locally? More specifically, let's talk about automakers who are producing electric vehicles in the United States. Will they need to source their raw materials locally? Is that important, and will that help them avoid some of the supply chain disruption that something like a pandemic like COVID-19 can cause? This is a great opportunity to say thanks to today's video sponsor, Piedmont Lithium, as they actually have a project based in North Carolina where Tesla has 2 of their 3 top suppliers. The localization of raw materials such as lithium will continue to play a key factor as we put more electric vehicles on the road. Whether it's Tesla or any other major automaker in the United States, it will be fundamental to source the raw materials like lithium here in North America. To learn more about Piedmont, you can go to piedmontlithium.com or check them out on social or at their NASDAQ ticker PLL.
I think from my perspective, Vivas, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. My perspective is the responsibility, there's two things. One is to reduce the cost of making these batteries, which means you're reducing the supply chain as much as possible to a local area. Now, that might not be possible on everything. You might not get economic cobalt deposits right next to where you build a battery plant, but can you put a supersized battery plant there? Can you put a supersized anode and cathode plant? Then when you have these large components, when you have this ecosystem beginning to build out, then all of a sudden domestic sources of raw materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, some of those start to become economic because they're getting absorbed more into supply chain. The large customers based in the US. And I think that localization challenge first starts with the cathode anode plants, first starts with those immediate steps outside of where the battery plant is, and then the raw materials come into play. But I think another aspect is definitely supply security as well, because for every midstream component, so lithium chemical, nickel chemical, cobalt chemical, graphite anode, manganese chemical, China controls over 50% of the supply for every single one of these elements. If one of these raw materials gets disrupted, you can't make a battery. There's no replacement for them. You have to completely change your chemistry or your process. And that's something I think people don't clock on. It's only one raw material of the big 5 that you need to be disrupted. I think that's a huge risk for automakers, for battery makers. Tesla clocked onto that risk. I don't think other automakers are.
If I could add to that, in the process of making a battery cell, if you were to go all the way back down to the atoms of lithium and nickel coming out of the ground, the only part of the supply chain that is impossible according to the laws of physics to move is the mine. The mine is where the mine is. I mean, it's been formed over tens of thousands of years of geological activity. The chemical manufacturing, the specialty chemicals, the cathode, the anode, the cells, they can be made theoretically anywhere in the world. It's just a question of at what cost. What we've seen with the supply chain disruptions in COVID-19 across all industries, including automotive, is an increased awareness around reshoring critical supply chains. And the battery supply chain, as Simon has pointed out, is highly concentrated in one country and in one region. China, and in general, I would say China, Japan, Korea control most of the global battery supply chain. So Simon was at the US Senate last week to testify again about the fact that the US needs to reshore more of the supply chain for battery cell manufacturing and critical chemicals manufacturing for batteries to the United States to ensure that there isn't a future disruption of the supply chain.
Yeah, so energy independence and national security seem to be at the forefront of the need for more legislation around encouraging raw material development, localized raw material development. So, it would seem like more legislation would be important to encourage companies that are located where battery production facilities are locally, would it seem like the legislation would be important to encourage that industry to continue to develop, either by removing the red tape, minimizing the red tape, or encouraging it through incentives like encouraging tax reduction, tax incentives around these investments.
Yeah, I agree. The government has to get involved more for the sole purpose of bringing all these dispersed components together of what is the US, right? So what I mean by that is, at the moment you've got industry which recognizes, let's say niche industry, which recognizes the potential and direction we're going with electric vehicles. But the issue is they won't be able to scale as quickly. They won't want to put the money in. They won't have they won't take the risk on scaling the supply chain as quickly as it needs to scale, as quickly as China is doing it. I'll give you an example. As I said in my Senate testimony a couple of weeks ago, China's building 1 gigafactory a week. The US is building 1 gigafactory every 4 months, the equivalent of at the moment. So 1 a week versus 1 every 4 months. It's far too slow, and therefore the government needs to come in. Senator Murkowski has done a lot of this work. Actually, really almost all of it has been centered on what Senator Murkowski has been doing. The government needs to come in and say, okay, here's access to cheap capital. So they need to bring the money in. They need to bring the let's say the mines for let's say all these brains from outside of the battery supply chain as is, and they need to have a forum to actually ensure that all of these people are put in a room together. They understand the opportunity, and then scale happens. Things start happening. At the moment, you've seen the Lordstown, Ohio investment from LG Chem and GM. That's a good start for the industry. But all of these little achievements, one, they're too small and they're dispersed. They're not. There's not really a coherent strategy, and I think that's what's missing. If you look at what's happened in Europe, Europe did the EU Battery Alliance, and that was the beginning of bringing in the money with the industry, with the ambition, and to show the industry that we are on this path. This is what we're doing. It gives confidence to the people that want to invest it. The US at the moment does the opposite of that. It almost, the discussion around this supply chain almost actively discourages investment. So that's just my thoughts. Phoebus?
It's not just a question of mineral security, national security. On the flip side, this is a great job creation opportunity. And that's something that we've seen a lot of politicians will latch onto, is the fact that specialty chemicals manufacturing in this high-value future technology supply chain creates high-paying, high-skilled jobs, which has economic value multipliers across their jurisdictions. So, yes, the Tesla Gigafactory in Nevada is very impressive, as is the fact that other companies are catching on to build gigafactories here in the US. But we still need more in the USA, both from factories and the adjoining supply chains. We've seen Europe have a cohesive strategy, like Simon said. The global industry, just to replace more of the gasoline cars that are on the road, to benefit from the promise of electrification across all vehicle types and across all consumer classes, just requires the supply chain to be built out in a bigger way and in a faster way than has been done in the last 5 years.
I love it. One of the things that we haven't talked about with localizing raw material development is the environmental piece of it. I'd love for either one of you to talk about the benefits of shortening the distance between where that raw material is developed and processed and then put into batteries, which then go into a vehicle. If things can be localized, it would seem like that environmental impact would be lessened.
So there's many factors that affects the carbon footprint of a product or of chemicals or of manufactured parts. So one is the types of reagents that you use. The second is logistics, as you clearly pointed out. Another major factor is the electricity that you're using. What are the sources of the electricity? So we've seen a big trend towards more solar and towards more wind, towards cleaner forms of energy across all developed markets. I think the UK, Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, because you actually live in London, is now running on majority renewable energy for the first time in the country's history. So shortening the supply chain and vertically integrating as many elements as possible in one geographic location, yes, it does solve the logistics challenge, and that does decrease the geopolitical risk of the supply chain. But what it does is it also gives the opportunity to take advantage of the tailwind of the grid in developed markets, shifting towards cleaner forms of energy anyway.
Actually, yeah, to answer Viva's question, the energy supply in the UK, I haven't seen the recent numbers last couple of weeks, but coal was off the menu because the reduced energy needs from COVID, and wind, solar, and nuclear were primary forms of energy here in the UK. So it's quite an interesting sort of shift what COVID's done. And I think the other thing that COVID and the situation with the US and China politically has done is it's aligned CO2 footprint with security of supply and controlling the quality of supply of these supply chains, which all mean that it's increasing the need for the US to build its own mines and its own processing plants domestically. Because beforehand, if you're a buyer in the US of cathode materials or lithium or cobalt, well, if you can always get it from China and it's not disrupted, then what's the incentive to invest? And if the price is cheaper than anywhere else, then even better. And it's consistent, you know your product, you know your customers. So the difference now is it's with the supply chain security issue, the political issue with the US and China, in addition to now a domestic industry being built out, domestic battery industry being built out and scaled, then all of a sudden the rules are changing.
I love this. I think this is something that is really important to dissect and understand, not only if you're an automotive maker, but if you're in the industry, you're following the automotive industry and this emergence of electric vehicles, and some would say, including myself, this transition away from petrol-powered vehicles to electrification. These things are really important to understand because there are a lot of risks, but there's also a lot of potential of electric vehicles. I think the upside is far greater than the downside, and I think that's the value of what Benchmark Minerals Intelligence is doing, is that they're following this at a very granular level, and you've got such a great understanding about what's happening in the industry, and this is going to grow. The industry is going to grow. So as we wrap up here, you've got several types of people who watch my videos. You've got the consumers and the enthusiasts for electric vehicles. I'd like for you to just talk about how they can sort of follow along with what your organization is doing. But you probably also have things like investors, investment firms, and automotive companies watching this video right now. So how can they also engage and follow along with the research that you're putting out?
For me, the best and easiest way, is, as always, is social media. Twitter, we are on Twitter all the time. I'm at SD Moores, and Benchmark is at BenchmarkMin, M-I-N. Vivas is, what are you, Vivas? Vivas 2K6?
At Vivas VK7.
Vivas VK7, that's it. And then LinkedIn as well. LinkedIn's a really good platform for us for long form. The website also is benchmarkminerals.com. So we put a lot of information on that as well. And we do a lot of events. We do our world tour each year, although that's online at the moment because we're locked down because of COVID. So, but yeah, social media is the number one window for anyone that sits just outside of the supply chain.
This is great. I want to get one more hot take as we're coming up at the end of our conversation here. Maybe got about 3 minutes left. Nikola has been quite a hot topic on Twitter. A lot of people talking about it. They've recently introduced a pickup truck that will have a battery electric option as well as a hydrogen electric or fuel cell electric. They recently acquired a company, and there's very little known about it, but I'm curious to get your take on these specs here. So they say that they've got energy density, this company that they've acquired has energy density up to 1,100 watt hours per kilogram at the material level and 500 watt hours per kilogram on the production cell level, including casing, terminals, and separator. This is not a lithium-ion product. What's your initial take on that? It sounds too good to be true.
So my take, and I'm gonna also roll in commentary on solid state over here. Every sort of week or so, we at Benchmark get queries around new technologies, new companies with specs that consistently beat lithium ion. And what I say is yes, at a lab scale, at a pilot scale, these are technologies that certainly could beat lithium ion. But the question is, can they beat lithium ion at a commercial scale, at multiple tens of gigawatt hours of production per year, consistently in a way that's safe enough for consumers to use them? That is the true metric for success in terms of what is investable at a large scale. Nikola makes a lot of noise, and I really hope that this technology does what it promises, because it's a benefit for the whole industry for technology like this to come out to market. But in terms of how I'd feel as an investor, I would say the proof is in the pudding, and I'm going to have to see a little bit more in terms of production that can safely pass muster on the road for consumers before I'd buy something like this.
Once you see it in a vehicle and you see these plants at scale, and you can see what the cost of the vehicle is, then that's your answer. Not technical specs on a sheet. Treat those with a massive iceberg-sized grain of salt.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight into the industry. I would encourage everyone who's not following the two of these guests, as well as Benchmark Minerals, to go do that today. Great content, great insight and knowledge in the industry, and will become more and more important. So thanks, you two, for coming on, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Sean, for the great work that you do on this channel for all of your fans. We really appreciate this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.